January 15th, 1947. A woman walking with her child spots something in an empty lot in Los Angeles. She thinks it's a broken mannequin. It's not. It's a body, cut clean in half, drained of blood, posed like a sick piece of art, left for a stranger to find. Her name was Elizabeth Short, but the world would come to know her by a darker name, the Black Dahlia. Nearly 80 years later, nobody has ever been arrested for what happened to her. And the most chilling suspect? He was hiding inside the killer's own family. Elizabeth Short was born on July 29th, 1924, in Hyde Park, Massachusetts, the third of 5 daughters. Her early life was already marked by hardship. She suffered from severe asthma and bronchitis as a child, undergoing lung surgery in her teens. Then when she was young, her father Cleo Short vanished. He left his car abandoned on a bridge, and everyone assumed he'd taken his own life. Years later, the family discovered he was very much alive. He'd staged his disappearance and started a new life in California. Elizabeth grew up idolizing the movies. She was strikingly pretty, pale skin, dark hair, a dramatic sense of style that included a preference for all black outfits, which is where part of her later nickname would come from. As a teenager and young woman, she bounced between Massachusetts and Florida for her health, before eventually reconnecting with her estranged father and moving to California in 1943, hoping to break into acting. It didn't work out the way she dreamed. She never landed real acting work. Instead, she lived a rootless, unstable life, moving between cheap hotels, boarding houses, and the couches of acquaintances, often with no steady income, borrowing money and relying on the kindness or interest of men, many of them servicemen she met during and after the war. She had a habit of telling different stories about herself to different people, sometimes claiming to be an actress, sometimes inventing details about a fiancé who had died in the war. She wasn't a criminal or a bad girl, as later tabloids implied. She was young, broke, and adrift in a city that chewed up thousands of girls just like her. In late 1946 and early January 1947, Short's movements become the subject of intense historical scrutiny because they're the last trace of her before she disappeared. She had been staying in San Diego with a family who'd taken her in. On January 8, 1947, a man named Robert "Red" Manley, a traveling salesman she'd been casually seeing, drove her back up to Los Angeles. He dropped her off in the afternoon of January 9th at the Biltmore Hotel in downtown LA. Manley said she told him she was meeting her sister there. Hotel staff confirmed seeing her in the lobby that day. After that, nothing. No confirmed sighting for 6 days. Where she went, who she was with, what happened to her during that missing week has never been established. This gap is the black hole at the center of the entire case. On the morning of January the 15th, 1947, a woman named Betty Bersinger was walking with her 3-year-old daughter along Norton Avenue in the Leimert Park neighborhood of Los Angeles, past a vacant, weedy lot. She glanced over and saw what looked like a broken store mannequin lying in the grass. It wasn't a mannequin. It was Elizabeth Short's body, and what the police found when they arrived was one of the most horrifying crime scenes in LAPD history. Her body had been severed completely in half at the waist, with a precision that immediately made investigators wonder if the killer had surgical or anatomical training. The two halves had been posed deliberately, arranged in the grass in a way that seemed designed to shock and degrade, not just discard. Her face had deep lacerations cut from the corners of her mouth toward her ears, an injury sometimes called a Glasgow smile. Her body showed signs of torture and mutilation that had occurred before death. And critically, there was almost no blood at the scene. That meant this vacant lot wasn't where she was killed. She'd been murdered somewhere else, completely drained, cleaned, and then transported and staged here. The killer had taken real time and care doing this, which terrified investigators because it suggested cold, deliberate control rather than a frenzied, impulsive act. Because the body was found without identification, LAPD initially struggled to identify her. But her fingerprints were on file. She'd been arrested once as a teenager for underage drinking and had also been fingerprinted for a wartime job application. The FBI's fingerprint database confirmed her identity within about a day. Elizabeth Short, 22 years old. Once her name went public, the press erupted. The Los Angeles Examiner, a Hearst newspaper, treated the story as a gold mine. Reporters raced detectives to witnesses. In one now infamous episode, journalists reportedly told Short's mother over the phone that her daughter had won a beauty contest just to keep her talking long enough to extract personal details and photographs before breaking the real news of her murder. It was tabloid journalism at its most predatory. It was around this time that the press coined the nickname the Black Dahlia, combining Short's preference for black clothing with the title of a recent film noir, The Blue Dahlia, 1946. The name stuck instantly and turned Elizabeth Short from a person into a legend. About 10 days after the murder, someone calling themselves the Black Dahlia Avenger began sending taunting messages to newspapers, assembled from cut-out newspaper letters. One package sent to the Examiner contained some of Short's actual belongings, her birth certificate, social security card, and an address book with a page torn out. Whether this was the real killer toying with police and press, or an opportunist capitalizing on the frenzy, was never confirmed. It added to the media chaos and made an already difficult case harder to investigate cleanly. Part 6. The investigation collapses under its own weight. The scale of public attention became both a resource and a curse for the LAPD. On one hand, tips poured in. On the other, the department was flooded with over 60 false confessions. Over the following years, people, some clearly disturbed, claiming responsibility for a murder they had nothing to do with. Sorting real leads from noise consumed enormous investigative resources. Robert "Red" Manley, the salesman who'd driven her to LA, was an obvious early suspect simply because he was one of the last known people to see her alive. He was interrogated repeatedly and given polygraph tests. Eventually, investigators concluded he wasn't involved and cleared him, though the suspicion trailed him for years. Detectives also focused heavily on the medical community, reasoning that the clean bisection of the body suggested someone with surgical knowledge, a doctor, a medical student, a mortician, or someone with similar training. Decades later, the most famous suspect theory emerged from an unlikely source: a retired LAPD homicide detective named Steve Hodel, investigating his own father. Dr. George Hodel was a Los Angeles physician with a colorful, troubling personal history. He'd been investigated by the LAPD in 1949, 2 years after the Black Dahlia murder, for an unrelated matter, and during that investigation, police had bugged his house. Surveillance recordings reportedly captured him making disturbing statements. Decades later, after his father's death in 1999, Steve Hodel began researching old case files and became convinced his father was the Black Dahlia killer and possibly connected to several other unsolved murders from the era. He published his findings in the book Black Dahlia Avenger, 2003, laying out circumstantial evidence, alleged photographic connections, and the old surveillance material. It's a compelling theory and widely discussed in true crime circles, but it has never been proven in a court of law, and George Hodel was never charged before he died. Several factors combined to keep this case cold for nearly 80 years. The actual murder scene was never located, since the body had been moved and drained of blood elsewhere. Short's transient, constantly shifting social circle meant investigators had a huge number of shallow leads and almost no deep ones. Media interference, reporters reaching witnesses before police, staged photographs, sensationalized coverage contaminated the investigation almost from day one. 1947 forensic science had none of the tools, DNA analysis, digital records, modern trace evidence techniques that could crack a similar case today. The flood of false confessions wasted time and resources for years. The case technically remains open with the LAPD, but with every possible witness and suspect from 1947 now long dead, it's effectively unsolvable in any legal sense. Elizabeth Short's murder became one of the defining crime stories of 20th century America. Not just because of its brutality, but because it seemed to symbolize something dark underneath the glamour of post-war Hollywood. A young woman who came chasing fame and instead became famous for the way she died. It inspired James Ellroy's acclaimed 1987 novel, The Black Dahlia, part of his LA Quartet series, later adapted into a 2006 film directed by Brian De Palma. It's been the subject of dozens of documentaries, podcasts, and books, and remains one of the most discussed unsolved murders in American history.